and welcome to Grade Gov News. Well, today we're going to talk about the Fiscal Cliff. I know you've heard a ton about it. You are probably sick and tired of hearing the word Fiscal Cliff. But let's take a little history lesson. Let's go back in time a little bit. Let's go back in the day to 1990 and the 1990 budget agreement. This was a budget summit agreement that was actually put together because they were worried about across-the-board cuts. They were worried about a sequester. Does any of this sound familiar? And the sequester was going to hit the federal government to the tune of 35% in non-defense programs, and 31% was going to slash defense. And this was the result of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings law that was passed in 1985. So you had leaders in the United States Senate. You had Senate Republican leader Bob Dole. You had Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. You had the House Republican leader Bob Michel. You had the House Democratic leader Dick Gephardt, and you had Speaker Foley. The scenario was this: the President of the United States was George H.W. Bush. And you had 55 Senate Democrats versus 45 Senate Republicans. Actually, that's the ratio that will be in the new Congress, the 113th Congress, when they come back in January. And they had a margin, the Democrats had a margin of majority in the House of 68 seats. So you had a Republican president, George Bush Sr., and then you had Democratic House and Democratic Senate. And what were they worried about again? They were worried about 35% across the board cuts known as the sequester, and it came from the Graham-Rudman-Hollings law of 1985. Actually, back in August of 2011, when they created the super committee, when they had that debt deal that created the super committee that failed, that produced the sequester that's going to happen, that's part of the fiscal cliff that will happen in January, they modeled it after the Graham-Rudman-Hollings bill of 1985. So in 1990, Congress was scared to death of this across-the-board sequester. So they decided to have a weekend meeting at Andrews Air Force Base. All of the leaders I just named were going to meet at Andrews Air Force Base, and the President's Treasury Secretary, Nick Brady, was going to be there also. They met at Andrews Air Force Base, which is right outside D.C. in the suburbs of Maryland. It was supposed to be a weekend meeting, and it went for 11 days. They were looking for $500 billion in cuts. That's what they were trying to save. Well, they found it. But what were the Democrats looking for? The Democrats were looking for, take a guess, tax increases. What was President Bush was looking for? He wanted a reduction in capital gains. He wanted to try to get the country and get our investment back on track. So he wanted to reduce the capital gains. And as I said, the congressional Democrats wanted taxes on the wealthy. What did they end up settling for? They settled for limiting deductions for the wealthy. Does this sound at all familiar? The $500 billion came in about 2/3 spending cuts and about 1/3 in tax increases. And you know what? Less than 10% of it had anything to do with entitlements, fixing entitlements. You know what? The first one of these 1990 budget agreements actually got defeated. They produced it on paper, and the House of Representatives defeated it, and they defeated it under the helm of a congressman from Georgia by the name of Newt Gingrich. He was a conservative congressman. He was the whip in the Republican Party, and he defeated what Bob Michel, the House Republican leader, had given as a result, given the end product being from the 1990 Andrews Air Force Base Summit Agreement. So they went back to the drawing board, and they ended up getting an agreement that passed the Senate, the House, and was signed into law in November of 1990. What was so magic about the 1990 budget agreement? As I said, it cut spending by 2/3. It raised taxes in the form of taking away tax deductions by about 1/3. But what was so wonderful, what was so unique about this agreement was the fact that it created enforcement mechanisms to slow spending. It created actual spending reductions over a 10-year period so that President Clinton, the new president coming in 1994, was able to have budget surpluses and balanced budgets from 1994 to 2001. Most people, most Hill watchers, most budget folks will say that the 1990 agreement led to that. Now, they had another agreement in 1993 and another agreement in 1997. But really, the catalyst for all of those agreements and for the budget surpluses that this country enjoyed from 94 to 2001 was from, as I said, the budget agreement from 1990. What's the difference? There's a huge difference. Speaker Boehner said of President Obama's new proposal that he gave to Congress this past Friday, well, we're almost nowhere. That's right, he said we're almost nowhere. The president's proposal has $1.6 trillion in tax increases. It has about $400 billion in spending cuts. But then on top of that, the president wants a new stimulus plan, a new stimulus spending bill to the tune of about $255 billion. Senator McConnell said it was a non-starter, and as I said, Speaker Boehner said we're almost nowhere. So really, where are they? Well, there is a move now in the House of Representatives to try to see if they will have another redo of the Bush tax cuts, extending them for everybody except for those making over $250,000. The Senate actually passed that proposal July 25th. The vote was 51 to 48. But then when the bill went over to the House of Representatives, the House defeated it August 1. There is some idea of maybe having that vote again next week in the House. And if it shows another defeat, then they can show that to the president and say, these tax increases are a non-starter, and maybe they'll go back to the drawing board. What really needs to happen? The president needs to show some leadership. The leaders in Congress need to sit down together with the president and come to an agreement, and it needs to have strong enforcement mechanisms to reel in spending over the years. Not enforcement mechanisms that they can waive, that they can change, that they can bypass. They need to be strong enforcement mechanisms to lead to balanced budgets in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of history and going back in time. I'll speak to you hopefully in the next week or two about what's going on with the Fiscal Cliff. In the meantime, don't forget to listen to GradeGov Radio. You can find it archived on the radio tab on gradegov.com. And of course, you can hear it Monday and Friday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Blog Talk Radio. So until we talk again, have a great, wonderful week and stay tuned.